I represented Mr. Owen at his trial. Mr. Owen was a middle-aged, smartly dressed black man. He arrived at court early, and we had plenty of time to talk through his case before the trial began. His instructions were clear. He parked up and got out of the car and was met with Miss Cook shouting abuse at him, including racial abuse. He told her to shut up and walked away. He didn't report it because he wasn't that bothered by the incident and said that he didn't trust the police would do anything about it anyway. Unfortunately, although it had taken place in a public street, there were no witnesses to the incident. Whilst we waited in court, Mr. Owen told me about his daughters. He was a family man. He had a picture of his wife and 2 children on his keyring and kept telling me that I reminded him of his oldest daughter, who was just 12 but wanted to be a lawyer. Mr. Owen hoped to take his daughters to Disneyland Paris during the Christmas holidays and worried that if he was sent to prison, he wouldn't be able to take them. I saw tears in his eyes as he told me how precious his children were to him and how frustrated he was that he'd been made to come to court for something he didn't do. I tried to keep him focused on what had happened that day. I reassured him that although the maximum sentence was 6 months in prison, he was very unlikely to be facing a custodial sentence if he was convicted. The facts, as alleged by the complainant, would likely result in a fine or community order, particularly given that he had never been in trouble with the law before. The prosecution made an application for Miss Cook to have a screen when giving her evidence, which I objected to. Miss Cook was not a vulnerable witness. She hadn't known Mr. Owen prior to the incident and was unlikely to ever see him again, so there was no need for her to be shielded from him. The magistrates agreed with me and the application for a screen was refused. I cross-examined Miss Cook on her account of what happened, and her story changed drastically. She admitted the racial abuse, but claimed that it followed Mr. Cook racially abusing her, despite her not mentioning any of this in her witness statement. She also denied that she'd ever said that he kicked the car, despite that being in her witness statement. Despite this being in her witness statement that she confirmed that she'd read and signed. Unsurprisingly, the magistrates did not find Miss Cook to be a credible witness, and they preferred Mr. Owen's account. They found him not guilty. As we stepped outside of the courtroom, Mr. Owen embraced me in a huge bear hug. He pulled away and apologised, but I smiled. I was so pleased for him. As I looked up, I could see tears of happiness rolling down his cheeks. He couldn't stop thanking me. We sat down in the waiting area as I packed my things into my bag, and he told me how excited he was to take his children to Disneyland. Mr. Owen said that he would value it more than anything now, that he realised how quickly a person can lose everything. His smile grew and he announced, "I can't wait to tell my daughters about you." He started telling me how pleased he was to have been represented by a young black woman. His comments made my eyes well up. I could see the delight in his face. I'd seen a similar expression in my own dad's face. I knew I'd done a good job. I felt proud. I'm going to stop reading there. Now, the reason I started by reading that extract is because, as I said at the beginning, for me, it really highlights some of the important things that I see in both visibility and voices. Starting with the other way around, starting with voices rather than visibility. My job is all about using my voice. I'm an advocate and a barrister, multiple names for the same thing, but ultimately my job is to speak on behalf of people in court. It's an absolute privilege to do what I do, and Mr. Owen's case is a prime example of how me doing my job gives a voice to other people who often feel that the system is against them, that people won't listen to them and their voice. I have the privilege and honor, really, of being that person's voice for that day, for challenging the evidence or the purported evidence that's said to be against them. And in this case, helping someone maintain their freedom. That really is a privilege. And I do that in both criminal law and family law. My practice is mixed. It's not that common at the bar to be practicing as a junior barrister in both criminal and family law, but I find that those two areas completely complement each other. And they're both very focused on people's lives and sometimes the most difficult parts of people's lives. Mr. Owen's example highlights someone about to, or potentially who could have lost some of their liberty. And even if that had been a community order, as I say, it still would have been an infringement on his liberty. He was a working man, and that would have required him to potentially take time off or lose his weekends. But also there are, of course, more serious cases where people are at risk of being sentenced for a very long time, years, and even where they may have been found guilty or have admitted their guilt. My job is in sentencing hearings to reduce the amount of time and make sure that it's fair. In my family work, I am giving people a voice when they really do need it most. People's children, their relationships, their homes are often the most important things, the things that people value most. And in my family work, I have the privilege of being able to be people's voices when they're at risk of losing some of those most important things. So, for example, in my private law children practice, I represent parents who are often disputing with one another how often they get to see their children or where their children are going to live. In my public law children cases, I represent various parties, sometimes a children's guardian who works for the children who might have been taken into care, sometimes for parents, sometimes for grandparents, sometimes for the local authority. And these people all play various parts in determining where a child is going to live, how they're going to grow up. Obviously very important things, and I give a voice to various parties in those situations. So I feel that what I really wanted to highlight there is really in our profession, we are giving a voice sometimes to the most marginalized people in our society and those people who need it most. And as in Mr. Owen's case, where he was talking about wanting to go to Disneyland with his children and that now that he could go and how grateful he was for that. For me, that really highlights the importance of this job. On the other hand, we have visibility, and I will revisit voice a little later, but visibility. For me, visibility, again, is highlighted in Mr. Owen's case, but it's highlighted in many of my clients' cases. And for me, it's the visibility of me as a barrister, me as a young, Black, female barrister from a non-traditional background, something I talk about fairly regularly, is actually really important, not just for the profession, but for our clients. Mr. Owen said at the end of our case how pleased he was, and he mentioned it more in passing, but how pleased he was to have been represented by a young Black barrister, someone that he felt his daughter could aspire to. But in some of my cases, me being of the background that I am is even more important. We know from the review that David Lammy conducted in 2017, the Lammy Review, into looking at the criminal justice system, he revealed to all of us just how terrible the situation is for many people from Black and other ethnic minority backgrounds who just don't have trust in their lawyers. He called it the trust deficit. And what he really highlighted for us is that there are many people who are pushed through the legal system, pushed through the criminal justice system, who don't see people that look like them. And at first glance, people might think, okay, you don't see people that look like you. That's a problem for diversity, but how does it really affect the clients? And David Lammy explains that fairly well. There are implications of people not trusting the advice that they're given by their lawyers. And that's what often happens when people see, many of my clients have walked into courtrooms and seen white judges or white magistrates, many white lawyers, and the only time they see people that look like them, the only time they see other minorities, and this particularly applies for Black people, not just BAME as a group, but particularly for Black people who are hugely overrepresented as defendants. That's the only time that they see people who look like them. And so when they're being given advice by a white lawyer who is part of a profession that they see as being disproportionately white. And then they're going before a judge who, again, they know the judiciary is disproportionately white, and people like them are underrepresented. They start to doubt the advice that they're being given, and they start to doubt how fair they're going to be treated. And probably, that we can see that there's some justification in that. It's very difficult to have faith in a system that can't even ensure that it properly represents the population. Now, I've had clients who have said this outright to me. I've had clients that have said to me that they are worried about the fact that they're going into courtrooms where people just don't look like them. I said just a few moments ago, there are real implications for this. If a client, in criminal law, I think the best example is that when a person pleads guilty, as I'm sure some of you will know, if a person pleads guilty, the earlier they plead guilty, the larger a discount they receive on the sentence that they would have received had they been found guilty at trial. So, for example, if you were going if you would have received, had you gone all the way to trial and been convicted, a 3-year sentence, let's say, if you plead at the earliest opportunity and get the maximum credit, which is a third off, you would get a year off of that sentence. So instead of being given a 3-year sentence, you'd be given a 2-year sentence. And that's to recognise the fact that you have acknowledged guilt at an early stage and saved not only court time and expense, but sometimes victims, witnesses being cross-examined and the effects that can have. If, as a lawyer, you're giving your client advice that it is in their interest to plead guilty, and they don't trust that advice, and they therefore ignore that advice and they go forwards and plod on to trial, you can see how people who are distrusting of the authorities, of lawyers, may end up with disproportionately longer sentences than their white counterparts. And that is what we see. It's certainly, I'm not suggesting it's the only reason. In fact, there have been some studies, most of the studies have been in America, but there have been some studies that suggest that there is some unconscious bias in sentencing exercises in any event. But you can certainly see how there could be a disproportionate outcome for Black people who are less likely to trust their legal representatives. It may also be that it's not just the legal representatives that they don't trust, but the system as a whole. The fact that the system will, in fact, reward them for admitting guilt at an early stage. Again, as I say, the judiciary are likely to be seen as part of this system. And when we know that the judiciary is only 1% Black, it may leave doubts in my clients' or defendants' minds about how much they can trust that system. And so visibility is really important. It's really important to have a profession that properly represents society, but also for people to know that the profession properly represents society. And visibility is key to that. Being able to see that there are Black barristers, being able to see that there are Black judges is crucial in that. I know that I've felt it. I remember on just one occasion, but I still remember it. I walked into a courtroom and the judge was Black, my opponent was Black, and the probation officer was Black. And it was, of course, highly unusual to have everyone in the courtroom Black, but it did just make me reflect for a moment and think, wow, this is just so unusual. The fact that this is just something that I've only in my career so far, 3 years at the bar, being in court every day and sometimes multiple times a day, I've only ever seen once. And now that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm not suggesting that all courtrooms need to have everyone there, that everyone in the courtroom needs to be Black or an ethnic minority. I'm not suggesting that for a second. But what I'm suggesting is that we do need to have a much more diverse profession. We do need to see that diversity. It needs to be very visible to us. So that people can have faith in the system, so that they can have faith that even if they have got a white lawyer or a male lawyer or a Black lawyer or a female lawyer, it doesn't matter, because the whole profession is so diverse that they can have a bit more faith in it. Now, I said I'd come back to voices. So that was my that's my interpretation of visibility and voices, really, and how it affects me in my profession as a barrister. But I wanted to revisit both visibility and voices from my perspective as an advocate. And when I say advocate, I know I used that earlier as a synonym for barrister. But I'm really now talking about my advocacy outside of the courtroom, my advocacy in my capacity as Alexandra Wilson, who of course is a barrister, but also there's much more to me. I include in that being an author, being on social media and reaching out to young people. For me, it's that other side of advocacy that I want to address you all on now. As an advocate in the wider sense, so not just a barrister, voices is extremely important, because in order to achieve some of the things that I want to achieve, better representation, not only in the courtroom, across society, in leadership positions, in business, in the NHS, in schools, I want to see better representation for all groups, particularly Black people, across society. In order to do that, we need to have people who are speaking up where they see underrepresentation of Black people, or, like I said, in the criminal justice system, overrepresentation as defendants. We need people to speak up about these issues. Now, that can sometimes be very difficult. And often when I give talks or I speak to groups of students, people will often say to me, what can I do? This is all great. I really want to see better representation. I want to see a more fair society, but what can I do about it? I work in X or Y, and I don't feel like my voice is that important. That's the mistake from my perspective. Every single person's voice is important. Everyone has a voice. And yes, in my capacity as a barrister, I'm helping people exercise their voice and using my voice to do that. But in our capacity as ordinary human beings, we all have a voice that can be used for good. And I think that the more of us that start to speak out about the injustices we see, whether that is in books, I've obviously written my book, and it's been a brilliant platform to really communicate some of the issues that I see with race and class in our justice system, whether that's through articles. I've written articles for magazines, for newspapers, whether it's through interviews. I've taken part in interviews or podcasts. I try to get my voice out in as many ways as I can, whether it's through school visits, whether it's through talks. Now, I'm not saying that everyone has to do that. I appreciate it's very time consuming, and I don't expect everyone to be using all their spare time trying to get their voice out. But one of the easiest ways is social media. I think sometimes social media is overlooked, or sometimes it is branded as a kind of negative force for change, as a platform where people will often, bully or gang up on each other, and people, the whole cancel culture. But actually, I've found that social media can be an excellent platform to unite with other people in raising awareness of particular issues. And I think it's one of the easiest ways. It's free. You can do it in your free time when you get a chance to really spread awareness of the issues that matter most to you. And it really does give people a voice in an international way, in a way that we may not have been able to do before social media. I can send a tweet and someone could be reading it in Japan or Jamaica or America. Someone could be reading it all from anywhere in the world instantly. They don't have to wait for me to write a book and post it. It really is an instant way to get your voice across. And I think that my message really to anyone sitting there thinking, well, what can I do about using my voice for change, really is social media is an excellent platform to do so. In terms of visibility and my work as an advocate in the wider sense, I think that visibility is something that I have personally personally struggled with a little bit. I'm trying to tackle it. It's something that I have personally struggled a little bit with. Being visible through other platforms, so not through my work and visibility in the courtroom, but being visible, for example, on social media, or being visible in writing a book or interviews, the various ways that I just set out. Being very visible comes with some responsibility, but it also does come with some drawbacks. You really are putting your face out there, and you as a person out there for criticism. And particularly, and I think this is where some people worry about social media, is that, of course, there's the mask for some people of the internet. And it means that when you're putting yourself out there, advocating for example, one of the things that I advocate for almost every day is, if not every day, is racial justice. And you're putting yourself out there on a platform where people can be supportive, or they can be very critical. And those people can be anyone. They can be members of your own profession, they can be your friends, they could be your family, they could be random strangers off the internet, or they could be trolls. They can be people who don't put their name or face out there. They hide behind an emoji or a blank profile, and say whatever they want, and there's no real regulation of it. So I've been subject to racial abuse before, on social media, that I know that there's very little I can do about. And I do always say to people that sometimes with having a voice and visibility come hand in hand. As your voice grows, particularly on some platforms like social media, but it also can work for written platforms like books or magazines or interviews, as I say. With that voice growing, sometimes your visibility is going to grow inadvertently, without you necessarily intending for that visibility to grow. And there are obviously some drawbacks of that. And I just think it's important to be mindful of that. So when you're using your voice, just be mindful that your visibility may grow, sometimes completely unintentionally. Overall, though, I think that my feeling about being visible is that it has made the world of difference, not just for me. In fact, I can't deny that I absolutely love what I'm doing. I absolutely love doing the job that I do. I love being accessible to students. I love being able to do talks like this. I love being invited to interviews and to write. I again see all of that as a huge privilege. But I also think that being visible, whilst there are some drawbacks, being visible has meant that I've been able to be in touch with so many people who also want to bring about change, whether they be, as I say, students who want to enter this profession, who want to make a real difference, who want to change the face of the bar as well, and who want to make sure that the criminal justice system continues to get talented barristers who are passionate about changing the lives of, the most disadvantaged in society. I've been able to connect with those people in a way that I may never have been able to do had I not had the visibility that I do. I've also been able to connect with adults all over, not just students, but I have parents. Recently I've had so many parents reach out to me and say that, some of them parents to very young children, but just saying that they feel so pleased that there's someone who their child can look up to and say, actually, this person looks a bit like me, and I can achieve what she's achieved. I can go to the University of Oxford, I can become a barrister, I can write a book, and why not? And that is so important. The reason that's so important is because role models really do make people believe that they can do anything. They remove those ceilings that otherwise can be placed on people's abilities. And so for me, knowing that I can be a role model to other people outweighs some of the negative things that I've spoken about in relation to visibility. Overall, I, as I hope have indicated to everyone, I think that visibility and voices is something that we need to, as not just people in my profession, but people generally, people who have any interest in social justice issues, in particular racial justice or class justice or justice for different genders, for different sexual orientations. I think that everyone who wants to push for change in these various areas needs to properly consider how they can best use their voice, and how, as a consequence of that, their visibility may grow, and how they can best use that. What I want to make sure that I can do as part of this talk is answer questions, because I know that there's one thing, me setting out everything I think about visibility and voices, but I'm interested to hear what other people think, and to also answer any questions that anyone else has in relation to anything that I've said about them. I hope that's been informative, and I hope that's been helpful, and I hope that the Q&A will continue to be both helpful and informative.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was really good to hear you speak and to have that little excerpt from your book as well. I'm looking forward to reading it, and I'm sure many other people will be too. So we have the Q&A section coming up. Feel free to put questions in the chat as well, and stay around to hear the responses. So I'm quite happy to read the questions from the Q&A, and if you're happy then to answer them.
Yes, of course.
So we have a question saying, throughout your law career, who has been your biggest source of inspiration, and what inspired you to get into law in the first place?
Okay, I'm going to answer that backwards, as I often like to do. As I said with voices and with visibility and voices, I answered that backwards. What first inspired me to get into law? So and this is something I talk about in my book right at the beginning, actually. And when I was a teenager, a very close family friend, who I also call a cousin, so cousin family friend, he was murdered when we were 17. And it's no exaggeration to say that that completely changed the course of my life. I struggled for a long time. I still probably would say that it's something that I haven't fully processed now, but especially as a teenager, I really struggled to understand how someone could take the life of another person who they didn't know. And that was the case in my cousin family friend's situation. He had been in an area he didn't know, and a group of boys had killed him. And they did, as I say, they didn't know him, but they were out to take revenge for one of their friends having been killed earlier that day. They saw a young black boy, they didn't recognize him, they wanted to get revenge, and they killed him. And it was something that, at the time, as I say, I really struggled to process. It led me to follow the trial of his killers, and other similar cases. I started watching cases. I started going to the Crown Court. I started going to the Old Bailey, and just watching these cases. And that's when I think I started to really realize there was such a huge racial disparity in the criminal courts. Every time I was going into court, in fact, I don't think until the point I'd started pupillage, I don't think I'd seen a black judge. And I went to court a lot. I hadn't, all my mini pupillages, I still hadn't seen a single black judge. And I so rarely saw a black barrister, so rarely. But I was very often seeing black defendants or black family members, or black witnesses. And it was just devastating. I could see this huge racial disparity, and I wanted to do something about it. At 17, 18, did I know 100% what I was going to do? No, but I knew I wanted to do something about it, and becoming a barrister really materialized from then. And in answering the question the wrong way round, I've actually forgotten the beginning part of the question. So Kezia, what was the beginning part?
The first part was throughout your career, who's been your biggest source of inspiration?
Oh, there we go. Thank you. In terms of my biggest source of inspiration throughout my career, I would probably say, and this is going to sound quite cheesy, but my parents. My parents have always had faith in me, always. When other people have doubted me, so when I changed to a grammar school for sixth form, and they told me that I was too ambitious in applying to Oxford, and that they told me not to apply. My parents, who didn't go to Oxford, they went to university much later in life. They told me, of course you can go to Oxford. And I'm sure they were sitting there thinking, oh, of course you can go to Oxford. But they never showed that to me. They were always very supportive, and they always they never placed a ceiling on my ambition. When I said I wanted to be a barrister, they were like, of course you can be a barrister. Again, probably thinking we don't know any barristers. But, you know, they've always been wholeheartedly supportive. And I think that has really shaped who I am today. And I honestly could not be more grateful.
Right. Shall we move question and answer and one from the chat? Yeah. So, okay, there's a question from Alicia. Thank you for that. Alicia's asking, I would be interested to hear how Alexandra felt as a Black woman in Oxford University and having to navigate that elite space.
It's a very good question, a very good question. And something I don't touch on in my book as much as I probably could have. It was really quite tough. There were some brilliant things about Oxford. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you one thing that really highlights the real low there, but something that also highlights the real kind of brilliant thing that I felt as a Black person at Oxford. So I'll end on a positive. I certainly felt, and so like Durham, Oxford's collegiate, and I felt in my college that being Black was something that led me to feel quite ostracized. In my year group, I was the only Black person, and it was something that I hadn't even realized would be such a big thing until I'd gone to university and really felt how different I was to everyone else. And I do think that there's elements of intersectionality there. I do think that, you know, I wasn't just Black, but I also wasn't, you know, I wasn't upper class, and, you know, I wasn't particularly posh. I'd been to like a state school, first of all, a state comprehensive, and then to a grammar school. But I hadn't really found my place. I still think the class system is a bit of a, it's not a neatly defined thing in any event, but I certainly felt like I'd come from an area that's from Essex, which is typically thought, you know, reality TV is what Essex has become famous for. And, you know, the amount of people that would sort of say, oh, shut up, whenever I spoke. And it was, we're not like that, please. Like, I speak fine. You know, my accent was mocked. But I think the real low for me was, I remember an instance where, and there were a few of these, but, you know, I remember an instance where after dining in hall, the masters, so I say the masters, the kind of high table, they'd all left, and it was just students left in there. And they used to play these games. One was called sconcing, and it would essentially be, you'd say, I sconce anyone who, you fill in the blank, and if you did that, you would toast to it. This boy stood up and said, I sconce anyone who only got into Oxford because they're Black. And I remember genuinely feeling so just stunned into silence. I was the only person, as I say, in my year that was Black. There was one other Black person in the room, in the whole of hall. There were only two of us, and our reactions were different. You know, the other Black person, he laughed along. I think out of being mortified himself and just not really, you know, I'm sure, but when I say laughed along, I'm sure it wasn't very uncomfortable laughing along. It just shows the kind of the difference in our reactions. By no means do I think he actively encouraged it, but it just highlighted to me what other people thought of me there. It was just a real indication for that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how clever I was, it didn't matter because I still wasn't one of them. And that was really what that was the message that I even left Oxford with. Now, I said I'd also have a positive there, and it's Black History Month, and I'm very conscious that often in Black History Month we do focus on the negatives, and particularly in my work trying to advocate for change, I'm obviously often focusing on the negatives because I'm trying to bring about positive change, but I think it's important to also focus on some of the positives. And for me, the real positive was that in my second year, I saw in the bottom of like an email, I saw that there were classes on racial justice in America. I think they were even just called race. I think the class was just called race. And I remember seeing it in the long list of everything else. It was a graduate class, but I emailed the professor who was running these classes and just said, you know, I'm a second year. I just would really like to sit in these classes. I can sit at the back, not take part, but can I just, you know, come along? And he was wonderful. I'm still in touch with him now. He not only said, come along, he gave me the same work he gave them. We engage, he encouraged me to engage through everything. He became my thesis supervisor in the end, even though he was at a graduate only college. He was absolutely instrumental to my degree, my time at Oxford. My thesis ended up being on the impact that police brutality was having on young African-American children. Again, something that I never thought I'd be able to study at Oxford, but he gave me the confidence to do so. And I genuinely felt that it was just so reassuring to have someone recognize the fact that actually race is an important thing. It's not something to just be ignored and left off the curriculum. It's something that is worthy of study, not just worthy of study, it's worthy of its own course. And albeit it was a graduate course, but it was just a real message to me that people do care, and academics do care. Some people care. And so that was a real high for me at Oxford.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I completely agree about it being, important in the curriculum on the course. But yeah, moving on to another question, kind of linking in, you touched lightly on your thesis. We have a question. Hi, Alexandra, thank you for your time today speaking to us. Following the death of George Floyd and the rising in momentum of the BLM protests, how has this impacted your voice when advocating for racial justice, especially within your profession? And are you seeing any changes being made, or is it still quite difficult to pioneer these conversations?
All of these questions are so good. I'm going to keep saying good question, and I'm going to sound a bit repetitive, but it is a really good question. I felt that around the end of last year, so once some people had kind of processed what had happened in relation to George Floyd's murder, and we'd started having the conversation in this country about there being a lot of similarities between the US, and that we weren't actually this ideal country that had kind of moved past racism, and actually recognizing that we have a lot of problems here that we need to deal with. I found at the end of last year that people were open to having these conversations, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for change. Do I still feel that way a year later? I don't think so. I think actually now I'm slightly worried that race is falling off of the agenda. This Black History Month certainly feels in some cases that there's less momentum behind it. I think last year in October, everyone was very keen to talk specifically about issues affecting Black people. And I think that now it's kind of been molded back into Black and other ethnic minority, Black, Asian and other ethnic minority groups, rather than really focusing on the issues that are disproportionately affecting Black people. And that's not to say that the issues affecting other minority groups are not important. Of course they are, and they deserve their own study too. This is the key thing. It's not a trade-off. It's not a battle for who's got the worst, the worst underrepresentation or overrepresentation. It's not a fight, and we don't need to be pitting minorities against each other. But what we do need to do is focus on specific groups and recognize problems that disproportionately affect specific groups. For example, at the bar, we know that Black people are hugely underrepresented in the judiciary. As I said, I think earlier, Black judges make up about 1%. That figure is not the same for all ethnic minority groups. And actually the judiciary can present themselves as being much more diverse when they use BAME, because it looks as though there's much better diversity across the board, when actually the representation of Black judges falls short. And I think Black British is the one group at the bar out of all ethnic minority groups from the most recent diversity report that actually is not properly representing income and talent. So Black British people are underrepresented, slightly underrepresented at the basically at the bottom end of our profession. So the incoming pupil barristers. Now, diversity on the whole has got a lot better at the bottom end. In fact, again, if you look at BAME, it looks as though we're doing pretty well. But when you look at the more specific groups, I think there are still problems. And so for me, there is some progress. The conversations have not altogether dropped, and I don't want to be discouraging of those who are still having those conversations and who are still having those more focused discussions. But I definitely feel like there's less momentum than there was this time last year.
Thank you. Talking about underrepresentation, Shamela has a question. She says, this has been so amazing and interesting. Thank you for your time. As a question, I'm currently a third-year law student and also interested in pursuing a career at the criminal bar. So have you got any advice for anyone in my position?
Yeah, of course. Lots of advice. So I would say the most important thing that it's fantastic that you're already set on the criminal bar. The most important thing, in my view, is to get as much experience as you can. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, you want to decide that it is definitely the criminal bar that you want to do, because I'm sure you've seen in the news, I'm sure you've seen criminal barristers talking about it. It's probably the worst paid part of the bar. If not the worst, it's definitely a contender. And so you want to be sure that it's an area you really want to go into. And people used to say that to me all the time. You sure the criminal bar? You sure the criminal bar? For me, it's worked out quite well doing family as well, because family is a bit better paid. And so just in terms, I'm always very transparent with students about having to think about money as well, because, actually, as you get older, there are things you need to buy, especially if you live in London, it can be expensive. So try and get as much experience as you can. People often say, okay, it's easy, easier said than done. How do I actually get experience? Apply for mini pupilages. There are a lot, and they're all starting back up again, because obviously through COVID, they were some were postponed. They are all starting back up again. There are lots of mini pupillage schemes that aren't just run through chambers, but are run through the Inns of Courts. So you want to go and look at Middle Temple, Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, and Inner Temple. All four Inns of Court offer their own schemes for mini pupilages. You can reach out to barristers. Sometimes you'll see on barristers' LinkedIn or their Twitter, they'll be offering mini pupillage experience. You can even do what I did, go and sit in the back of courtrooms. That's not quite having the mini pupillage experience, because of course you're not engaging with the barrister to the same extent, but you're still getting a very good flavour of what's happening. And especially if you spend a week there just sitting in a courtroom, you'll get a very good indication of what it's like. And you can still put that on your CV. You can say you went and sat in court between X date and Y date. So for me, that would be my recommendation. And the only other thing I would say is advocacy. Think about how you are, because the bar is I think I've said the word advocate so many times during this call already, but that is our job. We are advocates. We speak on behalf of others, and you want to be able to apply to the bar demonstrating your skill as an advocate. That doesn't mean you need to do mooting. A lot of people are into mooting, brilliant, and that is a good way to demonstrate it. But there's also lots of other ways to show advocacy. I worked as a teacher an intervention teacher. So I worked with small groups of children who were struggling in mainstream education. I did some focus sessions with them. That was a form of advocacy. It's actually a brilliant form of advocacy, learning how to break down quite complicated stuff to people who are really struggling to comprehend it. And that was great for when I went to interviews. I went and worked for an organisation called Street Law that would go into prisons, homeless shelters and schools and try and break down legal information that people need on an everyday basis. And I volunteered with them. So have a look around for opportunities, but the two big focuses should be work experience and advocacy.
Yeah, thank you again for that. We have another question in the Q&A from Chloe. It says, thank you so much for a great talk. I was just wondering if there's anything you wish the legal educators or law schools were doing better to support students to find and use their voices?
Yeah, that's again, great question. I think that I do. There is actually something that I really wish that legal educators and law schools were doing better in. I wish that they were equipping students with the resources to push for social justice issues. I found, and what I mean by that, I know that sounds a bit flowery. What I mean by that is when I was studying, I studied PPE, so philosophy, politics, and economics, but I know that many of my lawyer friends found this to be similar. I thought I was going into a degree where I was going to have a really diverse curriculum, where I was going to be studying philosophy from all around the world, and I was going to be looking at economic theory from all around the world and political thought from all around the world. And then I realized, actually, My course was nothing like that. There was one, if you could even call it that, diverse course, which was politics of Africa. And the fact that the entire continent had been reduced to politics of Africa was worrying in and of itself. But also the fact that when I went to go and do those lectures, they actually just focused on one African country. And so it just highlighted to me how little diversity there actually was in the curriculum. Now, I think that had I been offered, as part of my reading for my subject, more diverse voices, I would have been more encouraged to speak out in those ways. I remember it wasn't until my finals that I was like, actually, I think my voice is a Black feminist. But why am I realizing that 2 weeks before my exams? Why have I not realized that in my first year or my second year or earlier on in my third year? And the reason is because I wasn't reading any Black feminist literature at all. None of my reading lists had Black feminist literature on, except maybe one book on one reading list, compared to, the hundreds of books that were on my reading list from white men. And so it was just, I just wish that had been, that had been fed to me as important, because it was only when I sort of, as I say, this wonderful professor that kind of would feed me different views, kind of led me to actually work out where I fit in the academic circles. But had it not been for him, I don't think I would have been introduced to that until much later. And of course, I do appreciate, from an academic stance, academics want you to go out and look for your own material, but give us the starting point, and encourage us to value diverse, work from diverse authors, not just from, put on the reading list that all these, philosophy was a great example, all these white men are really, really important. You can go and read some extra stuff if you want, but these are the important ones. That is not teaching people to kind of find their voice at all. It's teaching people to regurgitate one particular stance. And so, yeah, that would be my perspective on that as to how we can help.
Thank you for that. The question from me, which is a little bit different from the other questions. To what extent do you think that morality, or lack of it, or a limited or narrow understanding of morality, is a contributing factor to the unequal or unfair treatment of BAME people in the legal system?
Yeah, good, big question and good one. I think this could be a thesis in and of itself. I think that morality actually probably plays very little role. I think that people might hide behind morality as an almost mask as to their prejudice, and pretend that they're acting out of morality when, so for example, the key example I would use would be the war on drugs, essentially, that is often, again, we point to America when we hear war on drugs, but actually in the UK we've exercised very similar practices of penalising people who are in possession of drugs, or possession with intent to supply of drugs, in a disproportionate way to many other criminal offences. And that particular offence, that particular group of offences, drug offences, have a disproportionate effect on people from minority backgrounds, but in particular Black people. And Black people receive much longer sentences for drug offences than their white counterparts. Now, often when we hear about drugs, which is often, we hear about, they're ruining society. Drugs are absolutely, we need to go hard on drugs because otherwise people won't learn their lessons. And a real moral case is made for why drugs are penalised so harshly in society. But we could say that about most offences. Paedophilia is ruining society. And I'm sure, sexual harassment is ruining society. You could make these arguments for all different crimes, but we don't hear that very often. We hear it in relation to the offences that disproportionately target Black or other ethnic minority groups, but yeah, as I say, particularly Black people. And so I don't actually think morality has much to play. I actually think it's, as I say, a bit of a mask, a bit of a pretense that actually we're acting morally here and we're trying to save society, when really that's that's not the case at all, and I don't think it comes from a place of morality. But as I say, I'm sure there's so many angles that question can be answered from, that it really could make a thesis in and of itself. So
thank you for that. And I'm a bit conscious of time. We've only got 4 minutes left and a fair amount of questions. So we'll just see how we're going, and yeah, we'll see where we get through. But we have a question here. Have non-people of color in your profession, specifically more senior than you, directly presented any significant obstacles or hostilities towards you, and how do you kind of navigate and manage this?
Yes, they have, is the first thing. The one that stands out in my mind as the most serious, probably, is one I talk about in my book as well, and it's when a senior barrister came. A senior barrister. I was in conversation, so I was going to say came over, but we were in conversation, and we were talking generally about criminal justice and how crime had gone down. And he said that it was bad that crime had gone down, bad for business, essentially making a joke about, we obviously make money off the criminal justice system. We're paid to represent people. And so he was saying, crime going down is bad for business. He then said, but it's all right, the Black community are fixing that for us because they keep killing each other. And it was, I know the second part of the question is, how did I manage it? I wish I'd managed it better. Still to this day, I'm sure people can relate to having an experience where you have an argument with someone and you leave and you're like, oh, I wish I'd said this. I wish that I'd said this. I wish that I had come back with this really clever answer. I wish I'd put that person in their place. But I didn't. I was a pupil barrister and I was terrified, to be completely honest. I was absolutely terrified of repercussions. The criminal bar is a relatively small profession. I didn't want my name to be associated with troublemaker. A lot of people, when I say that, they're like, but you published a book. I published that after I got tenancy. I didn't publish while I was still a pupil barrister and whilst I was still waiting to have my kind of permanent place at the bar. And I wish I'd handled it better. I've kind of said to myself since that incident, I'm sure I would handle it much better were it to happen now. But these instances happen a lot. I've had barristers who have sat me down and said that they think that there's too much of a push for diversity in the profession and that will compromise quality. And on that instance, did I argue back? Did I, use my advocacy and my voice that I have been talking to you all about and argue back with that person who was very senior? No, I went out to my car and I cried because it was devastating, and it's really difficult sometimes to challenge things all the time. It becomes exhausting. It does become exhausting. Our whole job is to stand in court and advocate. I do a lot of it in my free time. And sometimes when you're at court and someone comes out with one of those comments, or when you're at a drinks and someone comes out with one of those comments, sometimes you're too exhausted to fight back. Sometimes you just think, actually, today's not the day I'm going to have a fight about this. I'm going to just have my little time by myself. I'm going to call my sister or my mom. I'm going to them about it, or my boyfriend, and just have a separate moan about this person, but draw a line under it and move on, because I don't want to entertain it any further. Now, I think there is room for improvement in my method of dealing with things. I'm not suggesting you should just take things on the chin and move on. I actually do think there's a place for calling things out. But I think that I need to navigate how best to do that, because in this profession, and it's really important for people to recognize, people who sort of say, well, why don't you call things out? Why don't you report them? Our colleagues are often then our judges the next day. Barristers often double up as judges. It happens all the time. You sit as recorders or deputy district judges. So often my colleagues are also judges. And so I worry that, will it be in my client's best interest if I sorting everyone who says an appropriate comment? Maybe in the long term, it might be better, but I've still got to face the repercussions for the next few months or years, where I might be in front of these people and they know I've reported them, and it's all a very uncomfortable situation. And I think it's not a battle that I can take on alone. It's certainly a battle that really we need the profession behind individuals on. And that's what I'm really trying to do, kind of gather enough people to speak out about this so that we can collectively put an end to this, rather than individuals having to call people out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it can be quite a lonely space at times, can't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Do we have time for a last question? Do you think, Mel?
I'm happy to answer one. I don't know.
Okay,
Others
okay,
know. Yeah.
that's okay. So it's just a matter of choice here now. Do you think the 2017 Lammy report brought about any noticeable changes to how the criminal justice system operates, or are we still facing the same problems?
Could I add something to that question? It's kind of on the same note, another question we've had to the Q&A. So talking about change in the criminal justice system, Dan has asked a question here. Can it be adequately formed, or is it time to have conversations about abolition? And is it kind of useful to have academic theoretical conversations on this? Or I think those questions kind of work.
That is a really good question. Yeah, I'm going to end up writing multiple theses after this. I'm going to think I just go back to academia. So in terms of the David Lammy report, it's actually been something that I've been looking into recently. The government do an update it's biannual, so they do one every 2 years. The most recent one was actually not very helpful. Essentially, what they've said is that limited progress has been made. I think that a lot of David Lammy's recommendations were based on the US. And that is problematic for a number of reasons. Ultimately, we're not the US is the first thing. But second of all, the US can be criticized for many things, but they do seem to have a bit more awareness of the racism that exists in their country. There seems to at least be some consensus on the fact that, yes, we have some problems with racial disparities. In the UK, we haven't had that open acknowledgement, really, in my view, until last year. And even now it's being dampened down again. And so even though the David Lammy review highlighted so much of this disparity, we've had a real tendency to try and explain away the disparities, try and suggest that, perhaps it's class rather than race. And that, in my view, is very typical of us in this country, but doesn't go far into actually changing the criminal justice system. Now, in terms of whether I think there has, as I say, I think the change has been limited. I think that my particular focus with that report has been on the youth justice system, and he made a huge number of recommendations throughout the report. The youth justice system, the reason I flag that is A, because I have an interest in youth justice, but B, because actually things have got worse. And I think that's really important to note, that since the Lammy review, the number of, and if anyone has read the Lammy review, you'll note that Lammy uses BAME. He uses the collective group of minorities for most parts of his report, and that's partly because of data collection, but partly to show overall trends, and then sometimes does break it down into the individual groups. But what we know is that actually the population of BAME, people in youth custody, has grown. I think at the time of the Lammy review, it was about, if I've got this slightly wrong, it is definitely close to this. It was about 41% in custody were Black, Asian, or from an ethnic minority group, and it's now 49%. So half of youth custody is Black, Asian, or from an ethnic minority. Even more shocking, I think it's about 27% of youth custody, between 25 and 27% of youth custody is Black. Now, bear in mind, Black people make up 3 to 4% of the population, but we've got 25 to 27% of the youth custody population is Black. It's outrageous, and it's going the complete wrong way. Despite the recommendations, a lot of the recommendations haven't been implemented. David Lammy recommended making youth justice much more community-based, so that there would be, instead of having, one of the things I talk about in my book actually is that, youth, is it right having children in court? Should we even be having children in court buildings? Or should we be thinking about ways to kind of devolve the process? Should we be having hearings, if you even want to call them that, in libraries and community centres, where actually it's a much more collaborative approach and focuses on rehabilitation rather than the more punitive, let's put our kid in custody. Might that make a difference? It's not been implemented. And so we don't know whether it might make a difference. And like I say, it's in my view going the wrong way. And just to kind of finish off the question, I know we were talking about abolition. Do we think that it's adequately reformed? First, I don't think it's been adequately reformed. No, I think the criminal justice system is getting worse. I think the fact that there are continuing cuts to the criminal justice system, it's in the news almost every week. And, you know, obviously I'm not here to make a political point, but it is worrying that the continued cuts mean that barristers are leaving the profession. It means that judges don't want to sit because they're not being paid enough to. There's not enough courtrooms open to actually get these cases heard. There was a backlog before COVID, and COVID has obviously exacerbated that. There's a huge backlogs where cases are not being heard for years, essentially. Do I think that there's a conversation that should be had about abolition? Potentially. I think we do need to rethink the fact. We definitely need to rethink the ethos of, or the focus, I would say, the focus in our criminal justice system being punitive. It's supposed to be, you know, it's set out that, you know, it's supposed to be rehabilitative, it's supposed to be restorative. We're meant to have all these different aspects of justice. But actually, what we largely focus on is punishment. And too much is being left to judicial discretion as to whether or not they want to try and rehabilitate someone, or whether they're just happy to punish someone. Where, you know, it needs to be a lot clearer, in my view, that there should be an automatic presumption of suspended sentences. It shouldn't be you're having to argue for a suspended sentence. If we can suspend and not send someone to prison, of course we should. We need to find ways to help integrate people back into society. I think that the focus definitely needs to completely shift to that. And I can't see how that can be done under the current model. So potentially. What a strong way to end. I mean, or not. I've kind of sat on the fence there, but I mean, it was such a good question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks, Alexandra. This has been a really, really insightful and empowering talk, you know, for all of us. And thank you, Mel, for helping to organize this event, and all the supporters as well. And all our participants. You've been so popular, Alexandra. There's so many questions and we can't go through them all, so we've finished. But it just means you just have to come again, and we'll just have a longer time for all that. So big apologies to our participants who've got such wonderful questions there. So, yeah, but it has been very empowering for me. I think we need to do this more. Thank you very much.